Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marissa Waterman. I'm the Marketing Director here at the Academy. Here with us today, we have Dr. Paul Shanowski, the Director of Resilient Analytics. Paul will be discussing the reconstruction after the Marshall, Colorado fire. Also joining us is our Executive Director, Dr. Daniel Othler. Dr. Othler will serve as the moderator today. During the presentation, you'll be able to submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, Dr. Othler would like to say a few words. Dan, how are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you, Marissa. I'm actually really excited for this webinar by Paul. I just wanted to share because, a lot of folks out there think that these webinars are just like one individual watching at a time, but I'm actually in the classroom with some of my students. So I'm actually, so Paul, you got a big audience here that's very excited to watch your webinar. I'm just sharing that for folks. There's nothing wrong with having a watch party when you've got a fantastic webinar and things to learn. So I know a bunch of my fellow academicians make sure that students watch these webinars. I just thought I would share that. One of the things I want to do as we begin today is I want to say thanks to our patrons. The financial sponsorship of our patrons is essential to what we do as the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists. And we're so grateful for your financial sponsorship and your leadership in the profession. As I was saying, today we have a fantastic presentation. It's really focused on the future of environmental engineering and science. It was a winner from our recent Excellence in Environmental Engineering and Science competition. And I just want to give a little bit of a highlight. So we all know that our profession protects health, safety, and welfare of the public. That's something we all do. And we are all very familiar with the kinds of systems that we design, the ones that we build, the ones that we operate to achieve those goals. That's what we do as environmental engineers and scientists. But how do we ensure that the approaches that we're taking consider additional factors? Like, how do we make sure that the work we do as environmental engineers and scientists considers the characteristics of individuals and families and communities? When we serve the public, what does that mean? And how do we do that with more than just technology? Today's presentation by Dr. Paul Shanowski from Resilient Analytics is going to give us insight into some of these questions. He's going to talk about this fire out in Colorado, and I'm really excited to hear this presentation. I want to introduce our speaker. Paul is the founder and president of Resilient Analytics, a Stanley Consultants company. Paul is also the director of the program in environmental design at the University of Colorado Boulder. His consulting approach incorporates an evolutionary approach to climate adaptation to increase the resiliency on clients' projects. He earned his doctorate in civil engineering from Stanford University. And as a reminder, I'd like to tell everybody, do place your questions in that Q&A function at the bottom. I'll be reading them throughout the webinar. I'll summarize these at the end, and I'll engage Paul in a moderated discussion. Paul, we are so thrilled to have you here. We're excited to learn more. The stage is yours, my friend. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. It is great to be here. This is an exciting project to be talking about, and it's one that, as you'll learn as we go through, hits on so many different dimensions: our classic engineering design, resiliency, the community, future. And it's one that, we never anticipate that we're going to be working with actual disasters and what happens when this comes about and what you have to do very quickly. So I'm going to take you through today a little bit of what we did in this project to help the rebuilding and what it means in a new element of disaster recovery and design about how is all of this data that we have out there at our fingertips now, how does this impact what we do as engineers? The importance of what we call micro-localization. And this is something I always go back to when I was a student. We never thought about how things impacted a community, a local community. We had a single project we were working on, and we talked about cities and regions and states. And what you learn today is it's really about an individual household, one street, and how do we get to that level? And how do we use analytics to help us think about what we should actually be doing in the future, and a little bit about human nature? There's planning's great until you bring people involved, and people do interesting things, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's jump in. And as Dan said, please, as we're going through this, put questions in the Q&A. We'll cover a lot of different things, and I'm happy to have discussion and answer things as we go along. Just a quick thing about resilient analytics. Who are we? People probably saying, I've never heard of resilient analytics. Well, you've probably never heard of us. Likely you've heard of work that we do. I've been working in the climate resiliency area since 2006. I didn't even know what climate change was when I was first asked to work on a project in Alaska about how infrastructure would respond to permafrost thawing. And since then, we've done a lot of different work for around the world, World Bank, the UN, the EPA. We did a couple of projects that a lot of people have heard recently about climate change and schools getting hotter. And that was a work that we did a couple of years ago. We looked at 93,000 K through 12 schools across the US and how was temperature impacting them, looking at coastal infrastructure. So we've been behind the scenes in a lot of national things, a lot of policy that is coming out from the Biden administration on how to make things more resilient. So we've been behind the scenes. So let's jump in. Starting point, December 30th, 2021. A fire broke out, but you have to understand a little bit of the context of what was going on in Colorado at that time. This is just outside Boulder, Colorado. And in an area where I live in, it was one of the driest years on record. In fact, we set a record 250 days between the final snowfall in the spring and when we finally got snow in December. We typically start getting some sporadic snowfall in October, and then by Thanksgiving we're getting into winter. We hadn't even gotten rain in November. It was the driest November on record. There's a lot of open space in Boulder. It's a lot of open area, natural areas around separating neighborhoods, separating towns. And the grasses that were around, just sort of think about high prairie. That's what the environment's like here. You had 2-3 foot grass that was just brown all over the place. It had been a hot summer and wasn't a typical fall. On December 30th, there was a small fire. There's still disagreement as to what caused the fire. There's multiple different descriptions, investigations, but there was a small fire in the foothills across a major highway. So it was probably from where my house was, probably 4 miles across the valley. You could see some smoke there, which was not terribly unusual in the fall. We get lots of grass fires in the fall, and they're generally put out. Within about an hour of it starting, you could tell it was spreading and was not being put out quickly. Now, one of the things that also was unusual that day was the winds. So for any of you who've ever been out to Colorado, you know it can be very windy out here. But this was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The winds were blowing about 90 to 100 miles an hour. It was basically hurricane force winds, dry, hot air that was blowing. When that small fire hit that wind, picking it up, it blew down the open area. into the first neighborhood it hit, and you'll see that in just a second. Now, we also often talk about wildfires, and wildfires are associated with being up in, up in the mountains, forest land. Well, we've been talking a lot recently about the wildland urban interface. Well, this was definitely wildland urban interface, except this was grassland. And as environmental professionals, we talk a lot with professionals, fire professionals and stuff, about what's going on. And the common sort of thought was a grassland area would not be a large fire, that it burns quickly, it's easy to contain. So there never really was a thought that you could have a grassland fire that impacted severely an urban area, suburbs. In fact, in the work that I do, when we talk about resiliency, I often had fire professionals say to me, oh, you shouldn't rank that suburban areas are a high risk because grass fires aren't that much of a threat. So there really was not a escape thought. There never really was a thought of how you battle something like this. Well, like I said, about an hour after the fire started, it started to move, and it moved into a first neighborhood. And you begin to think, and you see this on the news, oh, we just saw it in Maui. What do you do? Are you waiting for evacuation notices? Where is it? Now, this was the middle of the afternoon. This was about noon. Like I said, December 30th, so people were home, which was a good thing. And people started evacuating on their own. Now, it's always a question I always tell people when I'm talking about this project is think about if you had an hour to think about what you were going to bring, if you were going to evacuate, if you had that much time. And then what happens if you have about 15 minutes? What do you bring? And this is where people can have all the lists that they want, but you don't necessarily follow it in the time that's there. Anyways, fast forward. About an hour and a half later, from where we were across from the fire, you could see it across the area. You could see it was getting severe, but there was a 6-lane freeway, a highway between our side of town and the other side. The fire jumped in 2 places, a 6-lane highway. That's important to think about as an engineer and a designer and a planner, because we think of these things as natural fire breaks. Nobody ever thought that a fire could jump a 6-lane highway, and it did in multiple places. Once it did that, it started racing through these open grasslands, just as fast as you could possibly imagine. Again, 100-mile-an-hour winds, faster than anyone. The fire crews had no chance to stop it at that point. What you're looking at now in these pictures is this is what it looked like as it went into the neighborhoods. In fact, this middle picture, this upper picture here, that house, so that's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a few hours later. That's the house at the entrance to our neighborhood that was there. Now, when we got the evacuation order at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and at that point, everyone just thought this was just something we'll be back the next day. It wasn't until you realize what happens when in a suburban area, there's no main roads. One way is blocked, you can't get out. So you've got thousands of people on one road trying to get out. And it's not only one road, it's one lane because the fire trucks are coming the other way. And there's no evacuation plan. It took us an hour and a half to get 2 miles from our house to the main road. And while you're doing that, you're looking out the back window, watching the fire coming closer. So when you see these things in Maui and California and people talking about it. It's definitely true. It's definitely one of the scariest things you can go through. Bottom line, and you can see how quickly wood houses just go up. This is the aftermath the next morning. So in 4 hours, the fire destroyed 1,000 houses and damaged 1,500 others. Entire communities were gone. And you can see in all of these pictures how there were whole neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods went up. This one on the right, which I'll focus on a lot in this talk in just a minute. This neighborhood was one of the first neighborhoods that went up. It was right near the start of it. This neighborhood was gone in 45 minutes. That's how fast a fire moves in an urban context, a suburban context like this. Why am I spending time talking about giving this context? It's because this is something that people didn't think could happen. We didn't engineer for it. We didn't design for it. What made this even more complicated, one last thing before I go into what did we actually do, is right on the other side of this neighborhood, right across the street was a shopping center. It was a typical shopping center, Target, Costco, etc. Typical shopping center. Well, what do shopping centers, these big stores have? Automatic sprinklers. A lot of water is taken up saving those, and it reduces water that's available for the fire crews to actually fight the fires on these houses, which is a very big controversy that's still out there. So you kind of have a context now. High winds, something that people didn't think would ever happen. Wood houses that go up like a tinderbox, and extremely dry conditions. It was everything that could be put in place that causes a problem. So we were called by Boulder County, we were actually doing some work for with looking at resiliency, and they called us a couple of days after the fire, called me and said, we know your team's working on this project for us. We need you to pivot. We need to figure out how we're going to rebuild after this fire. Who needs assistance? Because this is overwhelming to the county, to the cities. We need to know where the damage was, how bad, who are the people that actually needed assistance. Need to know this quickly. We want to know social factors. Who has the ability to rebuild? And what are future damage patterns so we can recover? And they said, we need this as quick as possible. So that was an interesting thing. We asked, well, why do we need this? They said, well, here's the challenge. This is from the US Census. This is the census area of where the fire was. And what you see is this is just one block. It just tells you everything's the same. Now, what you're looking at to kind of ground you, the fire started way down here. Here's the 6-lane highway that separates. So you have the town of Superior on this side, and across the highway, you have Louisville. And so where you were seeing those pictures is a lot of this area up in here. But they said, we need to go deeper. The available information doesn't help us. And they said, we need it on GIS. We have to make sure that this is in the workflow of what our teams already use. So make this solution so that we could see it. And that was really a very large aha moment. Today, every town and city, when they work with data, they have their own systems, primarily GIS systems. It's no longer an age of where you hand over, say, a CAD file or drawings, right? Nobody works in drawings anymore. Everything has to be delivered in a system that they're already working in. So in this case, It was GIS because we had to coordinate between 3 municipalities, a county, and the state of Colorado, and they all had to be on the same platform. So this is what, when you break it down, where the starting point was. We mapped this just from a starting point, what existed. So down in the bottom here, this is where the fire started. This area right here is what first bought the bottom. You see the first neighborhood, that was the neighborhood that originally got destroyed. The fire went across Superior, crossed the freeway to the east here, took out an entire neighborhood here and part of the hospital area. And then the fire ran across in the open space, taking out neighborhoods all across. So it was just a wide open area to run. It was like a freeway, a fire freeway. So the first question, how do we look at equity? Who needed assistance? So we built this platform in a GIS system. This was already in some of the area that we had, and we started collecting data. We had to have data about what the census data was so we could know what were how incomes. We had to get local data from the tax assessor to find out what each house, and we'll talk about that more, and what was the situation in each house. And then we had to coordinate with FEMA and the emergency recovery to try and find out what houses were destroyed. This was the official damage of destroyed, major damage, minor damage, and no damage. Now, this whole area is mapped because of the direction the wind was going. Everything in this map was impacted. And so you have to think about that for just a minute. So even though there were 1,000 homes destroyed, 1,500 more homes were impacted by the smoke, where people could not go back to their homes until they were remediated. This was the epitome of an environmental engineering and science question. When is a house safe to return to? What are the levels of different contaminants that are safe to what populations? Children, elderly, people with health issues. One of the things that makes this type of fire unique from, say, a forest wildfire is think for a second about all the things in garages. Fertilizers, oil for cars, lawnmowers, paint thinner. And then think about all the furniture that's in a house and what it's made of. Think about paint in a house. Think about insulation. Every possible chemical that you could think of was burned during this fire. And because of the wind, everything that wasn't destroyed, the smoke brought those chemicals into their houses. So you had two very distinct problems of people that needed assistance. You had people who needed assistance rebuilding, and then you have people who need assistance in determining, are their houses safe to go back to? Now, one of the things you find out very quickly is if a house is destroyed, it's under one type of insurance coverage. If it's not, you have a completely different set of rules. And there really are no guidelines in terms of how an insurance company has to deal with any of this. So you find out as an engineer, you start talking to lots of insurance agents where it becomes, it's not arbitrary, but it's definitely not cast in stone as to what's considered safe. So the first thing we had to do is figure out what actually was the situation on the ground and put together all these different data sets to just get a picture of what was going on. And I talked about localization. So localization becomes key. So on the left here, you see where it says Big Sagamore. Sagamore was the district. This neighborhood was specifically built with lower income houses. The Boulder area has become very expensive as it's become a tech center. You know the story. And so there's affordable housing. And this was a major development for affordable housing. As I said, one of the first neighborhoods to be destroyed. Every one of the neighborhoods was very different. Some of them had low-cost housing. Some of them had very expensive housing. There were pockets of populations of Hispanic people that only spoke Spanish. We found there was a large Asian population that was in different areas. So even though the census data showed this was just one homogeneous area, when you got down to the local area, people were in very different conditions. So we started going through, we sat down with the housing agencies, we sat down with disaster recovery, we said, okay, what are the key factors that go into thinking about who needs assistance? Now, there's been a lot of research done on social vulnerability, etc. A lot of it in emergency management and thinking ahead. This was unique in that there was no thinking ahead. This was react. How do we figure out what are the key factors to isolate the neighborhoods, the individual streets that the county should go and look at assistance? So the first thing was assessed value. What was the value of the homes? Why is that important? The lower the value of the home, the more higher the likelihood that the income levels are lower. And most importantly, the amount of time that people have to deal with things like insurance claims. So the first thing, and you can see the different colors, where were the values? And what we were looking for was who actually had the lower value homes. Underrepresented communities. All right, we talk about this a lot, and the reality is very true. Underrepresented populations tend overall to have lower income, lower value houses. They need more assistance. So we have identified where underrepresented communities were. And that was a fascinating thing on this, is how different you go from street to street, block to block, and you don't even know that these populations exist. They're just pockets. And identifying those became very important, and working closely with social welfare that had their own surveys on some of this data, giving a picture of, okay, this street we have to reach out to. One of the things that we found very quickly when we were looking at this is the importance of language. For someone who's not a native English speaker, when you're in the middle of a disaster, in panic, and trying to understand what should be done, what are the instructions? And I'll tell you, it is just kind of a little bit of an aside. We talk about how great social media is for helping, and there are definitely advantages. I will tell you, in this situation, it was a disaster. Why? Everybody was posting different information on Twitter, on Facebook. It caused panic. Because if you read the entries that were there, you didn't know where there was actually fire or not. and rumors spread so rapidly. Now, the problem is, why does that happen? Because the emergency management offices are very focused on trying to save people and can't be just continuously putting out information. So there's real questions there. And what's interesting, this was 2021. We just saw in Maui, the catastrophe there, very similar comments of lack of information. When you're in the middle of evacuating, you're looking for something. We had the advantage, we had our smartphones, we could listen in on the channels of the emergency management and at least get some ideas of what was going on, where they were dispatching. But if you didn't have that ability, English wasn't your first language, you have a lot of problems in terms of where you're going, and that's been thought of going forward. And that's this language. And you just found out that there's whole pockets of area that this is an issue with. Age. What is happening in the middle of this event happening? One of the things that emergency management is doing is trying to identify where are the vulnerable populations, most notably 65 and older. These people needed assistance in evacuating. And so this was one of the big things that was looked at, was where did they need help, and then rebuilding, which is where we were focused on. There were people who had lived in their homes 20, 30 years, and they just didn't know where to start to rebuild. So reaching out, helping them with, imagine people, elderly people in their 70s and stuff, and they're having to work with online systems to make claims, insurance claims, loss claims. They needed assistance for people to just navigate them through. When we take that all together, it gave us actually a household by household score that we used. And you can see that, dwellings, education, household size, income, what was the official damage, neighborhood they were in. We had to score that. Why is that? Because in rebuilding, it had to prioritize. Who was going to get FEMA help first? Who is the power companies going to help first? Now I'll go back to bring myself into this a little bit. This was a very awkward thing. Our neighborhood was not one of the most highest scored in terms of assistance. So I had neighbors that were very upset that why wasn't FEMA coming to our neighborhood and helping us right away? And I had to make sure that I wasn't getting in the middle of that and saying, well, sorry, we're not scored as needing as much assistance as they are, but puts you in some very awkward positions. But this is hyper-localization. When we are thinking about planning and engineering, it's each individual house that comes into play. So what? What does this help us going forward? We really we took these total capacity scores and we said, all right, thinking about rebuilding, who has the greatest capacity to rebuild? You say it's very different all over. Again, hyper-localization, provide help to those with the least capacity. And you see, we get down to very detailed areas. Each neighborhood is different. We have to recognize that. And I think that's one of the biggest things to be thinking of going into this career now is, or being a professional, is they're not just dots on a GIS map. They're households, they're people. And we have to, our goal is to not only make sure it's safe, but how can we keep it safe going forward? And that was looking at fire going forward. This was baseline. This was historic. Historically, there's not a lot. It was very low considered. Historically, in the area, we have about 11 of severe fire days danger a year. So it was not even considered high fire. But we look at a decade away, less than a decade away. We're talking about doubling, tripling that risk. We get out to 2050, we're not even talking about a fire season. We're talking about everything from May to October to November is fire season now. Complete different situation in terms of thinking about resilience. So, what was the result after all this? There was a lot of rebuild assistance, I'm happy to say, including thinking about sustainability. But this is what I said at the very beginning, human nature is interesting. You say, well, after all this, there should have been a lot of changes in building codes. There was a lot of proposals for changes in building codes. They were all voted down from pressure from the community. I was very surprised. I was a big advocate. Hey, we need to redo these things. What people said was, this was too much trauma to build back. It's going to be expensive. We just want our homes back. The emotional part takes over from the science analytics. And so building code changes weren't put in place. There was sustainability changes, more, better insulation, a lot more discussion about landscape, etc. The big things was the change in risk maps. This is now a fire area. Right? And a lot of regional collaboration now through data. This was a starting point. You know, I look at Maui, we look at other fires, California, and it's the same thing over and over and over again. We've got to learn from this. We've got to plan forward. Building code, sustainability. People are not going to do it on their own. Out of sight, out of mind. It's our job as professionals to really think about how are we going to protect people. So I'll leave it there. Take questions. Q&A, please put them in Q&A. I can go in any direction about the rebuilding, etc. And that was at the end, so we'll go there. Dan, I'll let you moderate.
Paul, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. Right, everybody? Hey, yes, you have an enthusiastic audience here. So it's nice to hear lots of folks. So Paul, I've got a number of questions that we put together, and I just want to kind of like read through them first, and then we'll come back and kind of pick them up one at a time, just to kind of get your mind around a group. So, and this is in an order that should make some logical sense, but it's okay, right? So the first question is, how much did the local community work together, right? So disasters occur all kinds of different places, right? Americans, fairly wealthy, maybe not as connected to our neighbors as others in other communities or other countries might be. So what's the balance between that we rely on our technology and money versus we rely on the fact that we know our neighbors and help each other out and have some local community structure? So maybe if you can speak to that one. Mm-hmm. Second one, Americans, we tend to love our freedom, especially freedom from Big Brother. You're talking about an awful lot of data. You're talking about it hyper localized. I don't know that I want everybody to know exactly how much my house is worth and how much I make and whether I get along with my neighbors. So if we're going to have all this kind of information, what becomes some of the privacy issues? How do we think about some of that? One of the questions that you already addressed was the idea of building codes, right? I mean, like we know areas that get hit by hurricanes have to deal with that, right? And we can think about fireproofing homes and how to bring those codes in. But, it was really interesting that you talk about, it was the emotional response, right? And so that is a really fascinating thing. That's in the Build Back Better, non-politics, just the let's rebuild our place. But I'm thinking we've got hurricanes, we've got fires, we've got floods, we've got, droughts that people would go to live through. There's tornadoes, there's all of this space. So when we're thinking about it, what's the responsibility we have as professionals to kind of push some of those best practices? And how do we engage with the political process to get them to want to make those improvements that are needed? The fourth question, right, kind of pulls a number of these together. When we create these risk maps, right, isn't that going to change what I pay for my homeowner's insurance? Isn't that going to create a game about which bank wants to provide mortgages in what areas? So, it's kind of like some people, they don't want to know their genetic information because you might find a disease. Other people, they want to know it because you might find the disease. So information is power, but also some danger. And then the final question is that, so what skills do we need as engineers when we're learning and when we're growing, right? I mean, this is a whole lot different than just the how to design the sewage treatment plant or the how to design the air pollution control system. So what other skills would we think that we would have there? So that's the space to speak into. So let's come back to this question on community.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can address that one a little bit.
So I was amazed at how communities came together, complete strangers. I mean, you knew the people who were your neighbors and stuff, but everyone's going through kind of the same issue. But the communities in general came together. I mean, the outreach that happens with people, stores, businesses donating clothes, and people needed everything. I mean, there was housing, trying to find housing. So the community really is an important part. If not only just for the essentials, but just the emotional part, support. People were checking on each other, and this went on for months afterwards. It's not, even though our news cycles last about a week, this is something that goes on for months and months and months. One of the most interesting one I had, so where we were, and just kind of finish the story on so we were the last house. We did not lose our house because we lived right above the fire station, and the fire department decided to make our house and the house across the street the fire line they were literally on our back deck. So the fire came all the way up in our backyard and up our deck where they stopped it. But as part of that, the windows all failed. So all of that smoke went into our house. So it took a year to remediate basically anything that wasn't solid wood or glass had to be disposed of. Basically, the house was stripped. So you imagine all of your clothing, all of your furniture, basically everything is gone. And having people to reach out is a big thing. I'll never forget, there was a couple that went around, they got game manufacturers to donate board games, and they just gave them out to families as something to do. So community is really important, have that connection. The big brother asked, privacy.
Yeah, that's the kind of question too, the big brother, right? I mean, like, thanks for sharing that story, right? But I mean, like, wow.
Yeah, so privacy
was your house, right? And so,
yeah.
Okay, so but do I want them to pick my house?
Yeah, so privacy was a big issue. So when we were doing this, probably we spent weeks working with the attorneys and stuff who actually could have access to that. And so the only people who had access to the overall data to the system were my small team and a very small team in Boulder County. Everyone else, all they got were some of the results, but the underlying data was locked down. It was private. So there were only probably a handful of people that had actual data on all the data on incomes. It was very locked down. So that everyone was concerned about that. And I think that will stay going forward. I don't think anyone will ever release that. It's a big piece. Privacy is important. I do want to hit on the insurance one, the mortgages. Okay.
Right. Because I mean, we're thinking about that, right? Like if
Yes.
the map says that my house or my second home or my dream home now is suddenly in a path of damage, boy, you just made it really tough for me to have any resale value. So
Yes. And I will tell you, this is one that I've struggled with for a long time while I've been working on this, because this is actually, it crosses engineering, science, and ethics all together, right? And where I've come down on this is, I think each person has to kind of come to their own thought about this. I don't think it's appropriate for any non-official entity to publish a map at the household level that affects people's value of their house, their risk, without any input that they have. So we have FEMA maps. Now the FEMA flood maps are an official governmental publication. There's a lot of time and effort in terms of vetting those. We understand 100-year floodplains. That's acceptable. Right now, there is no other official risk determination. There should not be risk determinations at a household, even a street level, that's put out there, because in the end, the people who suffer the most from that are the people who can't afford it. And there's just, people cannot have a right to go in and say to someone, your house, we've decided on a model that you don't know what it is, that you're actually in a lot more risk. And what's happened now is you can go on to real estate pages where they actually have that information for each house. It's completely unofficial. I have a real ethical problem with that. So we always talk about, we give whole regions in a city and we talk about future risk, but we do not get down to a household level. And I think that's an individual thing, but I think as engineers, we have an ethical responsibility to respect what each individual has and don't overstep that line.
no, it's fascinating, right? I'm thinking back to like the original the AIDS scare and HIV and what were people's status, and and there was a real ethical dilemma there, right? I mean, back to parents saying, I don't want a child with HIV to be in the school with my child, and
Right.
so and society has had to come to grips with that, and it feels like that this is a new and somewhat of a new space, right? I mean, we sort of imagine, okay, folks with a condo on a beach with a hurricane coming by, or folks living in a 100-year floodplain, maybe we would have had some perception that would be there, but certainly some of this, some of these fires is definitely kind of, in a sense, catching us kind of flat-footed. One of the questions folks asked was, is there something equivalent to the 100-year flood that tells us the fire risk? Is there some measure out there we should be aware of as engineers, or something that's being developed?
There is. So one of the most commonly used ones is one called KBDI. It's the Keach Bynum index, and it's the one that the Forest Service generally uses. It was developed by the Forest Service. We still use. So if you live in an area where there's fire risk, they'll come up and say, oh, this is a red flag day, or this is a high fire day. That's generally KBDI index. And what it does is it breaks things down to high, extreme, high, moderate, low fire. And what I think engineers need to be aware of is this change in high and extreme projected fire days, because that's really, I think that's going to essentially become like a flood map. It's how many days is your fire season, and that's going to start really, I think, impacting what type of things can be built, et cetera, that even down to roads that are put in there for evacuation routes.
That's helpful. That's helpful because that's a little nugget. So KBDI, right?
Yep,
So
KBDI.
we'll read more about that. But one of the things that's kind of a question, right, which leads on that is, the skills, right? I mean, there's a whole nother generation of engineers being trained up. And while it's interesting to think, yes, we do engineering design, right? But if you're an engineer, then how much are you also a structural engineer? And are you an environmental engineer? And are you, how much do you know local building codes? And are you a planner? And, and are you a community organizer? And so help me understand the skills that folks that are coming out of school, you would see them needing have, or the flexibility you might expect them to need to have to be able to survive a 40-year career going forward. So, give us some wisdom.
Yeah, okay. I'll give you my top 3 things that are one is become more familiar with planning, what the planning department's doing. Understand zoning, understand where building codes are in effect, because they're going to keep changing, and they're going to change faster than anything we've ever seen. And understanding that language and being able to talk to planners is going to become even more critically important. And it's not going to be like when I started, I was like, yeah, that's high density. We know that's going to be that way for the next 30 years, right? That's going to be changing. So understand what planning departments do. That's one. The second one, get comfortable communicating with people of different backgrounds, different types of professionals in very visual ways. One of the things that we as engineers like is we have lots of data. Here, come sit down and look at my spreadsheet or this, right? And really what people want to know is, show me a picture and tell me in 60 seconds what this is going to be. So that skill of abstracting, communicating ideas really fast, I know it goes against what we typically think, in that we have to really overwhelm people with data and convince them. There's a time for data, but they're not going to listen to data until you can tell the story real quick. So understanding how to abstract, visualize. And the last one is, not everything is going to be able to be 100% solution. Sometimes figuring things out to the 85 or 90% solution, and then we're going to figure out the rest as we go along, that's okay, and be comfortable with it. Understand when the 100% solution is needed. Understand when a schematic is needed. Understand the solution to the situation, because that's really important. Because a lot of times speed becomes important, and you have to give preliminary answers and feel comfortable with it. So bottom line, it's not always, you can't just sit there and spend 3-4 weeks working on the perfect solution. How to communicate your findings really quick on partial solutions, that's the skill to be able to do.
I love it. I love it. I've already learned 4 things. The KBDI, get to be friends with my local planners so I understand what they're doing. Your communication, that visual communication, telling a story, that really resonates. And yeah, the iron triangle, right? Good, fast, and cheap. And sometimes you got to make a trade-off between one to the other. Paul, this was a fantastic webinar. Thank you so much for taking time out. We really appreciate this. And we're going to hand it back over to Marissa to do our outro. Thank you so much again, Paul.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. And thank you, Paul, for sharing your knowledge with us today. If you have additional questions on this topic, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to put you in touch. We have several webinars planned in the near future, so you can go to aaees.org/events to check them out and register. If you're interested in sponsoring an upcoming webinar, please reach out to me directly. And just a reminder, if you're not yet a member and you're considering joining the Academy, please email me to discuss our membership options. Sorry. Last but not least, PDH certificates for this event will be sent out shortly. That's all for now. We enjoyed being with you today. Thank you so much and have a great day.